Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to another live show. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Please hit the like button as you come onto the stream. Helps boost the YouTube stream in the algorithm. Now, Trump has come crawling back to China while the mainstream media is spinning his Asia tour as peak diplomacy. The reality is clear. It has been an unmitigated disaster. His administration is quietly begging China to pull back, as he pulls back the 100% tariff threat while signing deals with Malaysia and Japan to save face on rare earth minerals. But what's the truth? The U.S. is losing the trade war. Living standards are collapsing in the United States, and China holds all of the cards. We discuss all of this and much more with our special guests today. We have Professor Richard Wolff, economist, author, host of Democracy at Work, and market analyst Sean Foo, who is a host of his own YouTube channel under his name. Gentlemen, good to see you both again today.
Glad to be here.
Great to be here, Danny.
Right. Yes. Great to see both of you. So let's get right to it, gentlemen. I wanted to first pull up what Scott Bessent had to say about the ongoing trade war saga and how the United States is actually seeking now to pull back this 100% tariff threat on China as the Trump administration tries to mitigate the disaster of its trade war. Here is Scott Bessent on mainstream media.
Margaret, I think we had a very good two-day meeting. I would believe that so it would be an extra 100% from where we are now. And I believe that that is effectively off the table. I'm not going to get ahead of the two leaders who will be meeting in Korea on Thursday, but I can tell you we had a very good 2 days. So I would expect that the threat of the 100% has gone away, as has the threat of the immediate imposition of the Chinese initiating a worldwide export control regime.
Deals, that'll be lifted?
Well, it was never imposed. So they threatened to impose it in December, and President Trump, to give me and the trade team leverage, decided that it would be a good idea for him to threaten 100% additional tariff, and it did give us a great deal of leverage. President Trump's very good at creating leverage for us. This is the fifth meeting that we've had with the Chinese. My Chinese counterpart is the Vice Premier, Dhaiphong. So we had a very good 2 days. We discussed a wide variety of issues, from the rare earth magnets to trade, to substantial purchases of American agricultural products, to the Chinese helping us in this fentanyl crisis.
So, Professor Wolff, let's start with you. Scott Bessent doesn't look so comfortable there. He was stumbling on his words a bit. The United States is seeking to pull back its 100% tariff threat on China. Talk about your assessment of how this has all gone. The panic now is over the rare earth minerals, as Scott Bessent said there too. How has this impacted this trade war, the U.S. empire as a whole? What's your assessment?
Well, I think watching Mr. Bessent, which is always, for me anyway, a bit painful. He's such a toady for Mr. Trump. He tries to put something reasonable or rational around what is a herky-jerky, on again, off again, rewriting the word so you don't say he caved in, but he provided leverage. That's the kind of corporate speak with which these people try desperately, when they're behind the headline, to make something of it other than what it is. Look, the reality takes time. A tariff regime, and let me make a footnote here. Tariffs have been used at various times by various governments for many centuries. This is not a new economic policy. This is not an unknown policy. compared to many policies, it has a long track record, and people in my profession, professors of economics, regularly teach as part of every international economics course a segment on tariffs, where students are required to understand how they work, when they work, how they came to achieve their objectives under these circumstances, failed to achieve them under those. All right. Having known all of that, an honest president and an honest secretary of Treasury would know, and I really don't know whether these two guys, Trump and Bessent, know, but honest ones would know that the way you represent this to your people is to say, here are our objectives, but many variables, including many we have no control over, will determine whether this tariff regime works and achieves its goals or whether it doesn't. Right? That would at least allow us to look at this situation. And I'll give you two examples. Number one, every tariff regime that I ever studied shows us a country imposing tariffs and then confronting 2 months, 2 years later, retaliation as other countries figure out whether they can evade the tariffs put down by the first country, get around them, work to reduce them in one mechanism or another, and there are several. And then if those don't work or don't work enough, then the second country retaliates. That, all of that, the evasions, the avoidance, and the retaliation together will determine whether the tariff has the desired objective. We are not even through the first phase because Mr. Trump raises and lowers them. In the words of Mr. Bessent, to make leverage, when everybody else understands it's a horrific uncertainty that makes the whole effect of the tariff undermined in half the cases and over-exaggerated in the other, and therefore has to be adjusted by Mr. Trump. All of this chaos means we don't know yet what all the effects are. And to tell us, oh, we've succeeded, well, now you're lying. It's way too early to say that. You don't have the information that would allow you to say it in any case. And we will have to see. And you can see it already, the up and down with Japan. That's really important. The up and down with South Korea. Now, I saw the headlines this morning, but again, the headlines are Mr. Trump making everything he does a success. And then we learn later, oh no, it wasn't, it isn't, or much less. And all of that chaos, which is what Mr. Trump surrounds him with, means that we really only have the biggest picture that we can talk about. And you, Danny, correctly said it. The United States' ability to dictate what it wants to the rest of the world doesn't work. What we're watching are now 7 or 8 months in which all kinds of countries, large and small, are pushing back, and it's only the beginning. This is a new assault of the United States, and every country, and by the way, not just every country, every large corporation engaged in international trade is now rethinking, what do we want to do to adjust to these tariffs? They're not all sitting there like duck pins waiting for the ball to hit them. They're taking active steps to get around, to avoid, to evade, and to retaliate. That even includes the Mexicans, the Canadians, and the Europeans. It's not just in Asia that this is happening. And until that's sorted out, and we're not anywhere near the end of that process, any statement about whether the policy works or not is completely BS. And I won't even go into the fact that if the Supreme Court decides against him, And let's remember how wigged out Mr. Trump got with that advertisement for 2 days in a Canadian newspaper, in which the point of the advertisement was to show how Ronald Reagan was against tariffs in the hopes of persuading U.S. Supreme Court judges to void the whole thing. If you think that the rest of the world is unaware of that, you're making a terrible mistake. Why in the world would you offer not to retaliate, even if you plan to? Say you are, because you may not need to deal with anything if the Supreme Court does your work for you. Every CEO knows that. So there's this game of the media pretending that this is all real. It isn't.
Yeah, and Sean, evidence is emerging of the effects of the trade war, as it appears that every time that Trump escalates and his administration escalates, especially tariffs on China, he ends up crawling right back and attempting to stop the bleeding. But what we have here is China expanding. You've talked about this, expanding the trade pact with ASEAN. And here in Bloomberg, they say it straight up that these this effort to expand trade agreements with ASEAN countries from China vows to lower trade barriers and facilitate a green economy, which may help, they say, Beijing boost exports and offset the impact of tariffs. Talk about how this tariff regime that Professor Wolff talked about there, how has it actually backfired on the United States?
I guess firstly, Scott Bessent simply has no leverage. As Professor Wolff said when he came out of the 100%, how Trump has equipped him with that, I think that's just pure blustering. The United States simply has no leverage on that aspect. Now, when you impose a leverage, we all know who really pays for it. It's the US consumers, it is people, it's the man on the street. And as much as Bessent and Trump likes to tout they have gotten record amounts of tariff revenue of around $30 to $35 billion a month, I guess that was the last month's revenue, it's simply a transference of wealth from the people on Main Street to the people in the government. And how the government spends the money is extremely, extremely wasteful. If we look at the data over the last 3, 4, even 5 months, when the tariff regime actually started, what did we actually see? Chinese exports to the world have increased. I guess in September, Chinese exports increased by around 8.7%, which is astounding. Everyone thought that, since Washington cut away China, the entire Chinese economy will collapse, exporters will collapse, but that's not really the case. Their exports are actually growing to the rest of the world. Africa is buying more. Europe, they have no choice, but they have to buy more as well. And as you mentioned, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, we are also trading more with China, simply because it's a matter of cost. When you decide to rack up the rates by 10, 20, 30% to the rest of the world, everyone else needs to find a way to sell to the US if they really want to. And the only outlet they have is China. That's why we are seeing a lot of free trade pact going on between all the Asian countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. We're all trying to get more cheap Chinese inputs in order to comply with Trump's own tariffs. So what's happening right now is everything is backfiring. I think we can remember Trump signing mineral deals with Japan, and I think you mentioned Malaysia as well. Now, this sounds nice. It sounds very good to the American public, but it actually ignores how rare earths actually function in the real world. Now, rare earths are not exactly very rare. You can find it almost in any country, and digging it out from the ground is only step one. The most important thing you need to do is you need to refine it. And this is where Scott Bessent, Lutnick, Trump, they're all going to have a very rude shock down the road. Now, 90 to 95% of the rare earth refining is done in China. And it's going to be quite hellish to replicate it in today's era. Now, China did it back I guess, 5, 10, 15 years, where environmental regulations, even for them, was quite lax back then. And they have entire supply chains fleshed out so that every time they refine rare earths, they get a much higher yield than any other country out there. So they do have quite a bit of cost efficiency. And all the expertise, all the engineers, all the experts, they are all located within China. And as part of Chinese retaliation against the US, they also impose laws that all these experts are to be remain in China and their expertise are not to be shared with the West. So right now we have a brain drain as well. So even if Trump goes around signing all these mineral deals with every country on planet Earth, well, there's still a problem with refining. Unless the US, unless Europe, and maybe even Australia, they're willing to dismantle all their regulations and really, they don't really care about going green anymore, it's going to be a hard time for them to compete with China. So what we are seeing is actually the Chinese expose the weakness of supply chains, the fundamental economic weakness of the US economy with this tariff confrontation.
Yeah, no, great points, Sean. Professor Wolff, maybe you can elaborate too on the overall effects of these tariffs, especially on the U.S. empire. How have you seen now, given that there are just a constant escalation of the tariffs? We see Canada talking about free trade agreements with China now in order to mitigate the tariffs on Canada. It seems like the more aggressive the tariff regime becomes, the more the effects on the United States in particular worsen. And we have, I don't know if you saw this poll, Professor Wolff, but right now Trump's popularity is not doing so well because of the cost of living, and the cost of living has not improved. As it says here, only 40% of Americans right now approve, according to the Reuters Ipsos poll, of how he's doing, and a lot of this has come amid this tariff chaos. What is your comment on this?
Well, I would like to stress in responding to your question is you can summarize as follows. This whole tariff gambit is about an effort to ease some of the pressure on the federal government because, as most people know, it has been running trillion-dollar deficits for several years now. That is an extraordinary thing. We never did that before. These are levels, whether you adjust them to percentages and so on, that would maybe make sense if you were in a major war, because the last time we did that kind of borrowing was, in fact, in World War II. So it is extraordinary, and the government has been put on notice that lenders, which are mostly Americans, but others too, are more and more hesitant to keep lending to a government that is borrowing so much so quickly. That's why we don't have AAA ratings from Moody's and Standard & Poor and Fitch the way the United States once did and the way other countries do. That's in part why the Chinese, among others, have reduced their holding of U.S. denominated treasuries, etc. So let me explain how what the government is doing, what Mr. Trump is doing, is mostly trying to ease the problem of the government. Notice the boasting that they've raised $400 billion so far this year out of these tariffs, and that's a record. They haven't done that out of this kind of attacks for a long time. That part is correct. So he boasting. Well, where is the money coming from? Well, all the American businesses, and that's who it mostly is, who import into this country are the ones who pay the tariff. Mr. Trump keeps saying he's going to hit the other countries with a tariff. That's very clever PR, politically convenient, but stone cold false, because foreigners don't pay tariffs. The American government cannot impose tariff or any other tax on people in other countries any more than their leaders can impose taxes on us. So American businesses pay the tax. Well, you might say, that's at least the business community. No, 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 no. You cannot forget that before the tariff regime was imposed, Mr. Trump took care of a more important piece of business. He passed a big, beautiful tax bill, and that did two things. It extended the temporary tax cuts from 2017 when he was president so that they would become permanent, which was an enormous gift to the business community. And he added and extended several more tax cuts. So what Mr. Trump is doing, a little bit like a flim-flam hustler, he cut the taxes on the business community to offset in advance whatever portion of the tariffs the businesses would themselves absorb. So what the businesses are doing is absorbing some, so far there's evidence for that, but passing most of it on in higher retail prices, making the consumer, the working class, basically be where the tariff buck stops, who actually has to pay it. And of course, the mass of the American people are answering pollsters by saying their jobs are going nowhere, their pay is going nowhere. Meanwhile, the prices keep rising. And if you look carefully at the prices, for example, disaggregating to food, I mean, we are stuck, for example, in New York City, where I live, the price of a cup of coffee in this city has gone up by a third over the last couple of years. It's out of control. And so you have an anger building in the population because what Mr. Trump has done, which should surprise nobody, is impose a tariff that puts the burden in the end on the consumer price because the business community has been taken care of by the prior tax cut and by the ability, one way or another, to raise the prices to the consumer, since no law and no government regulation prevents them from doing it.
Yeah, and this is a good segue, I think, Sean, to talking about the impact of these tariffs on the US dollar, because as Professor Wolff explained there, the impact on people in the United States, particularly those who work for a living, has been pretty dramatic. And I want to know from your assessment, what has been the impact on the dollar? I know you just published on this today, and how that relates to this kind of cascading impact of these tariffs in a much larger global sense, economic sense. Your thoughts?
Sure. I think the tariffs have largely been quite negative for the dollar. Year to date, it is down by 9 to 10%. So that is quite self-evident. Now, the problem with Trump is that he expects everything to be manufactured within the United States, but that is not physically possible. US supply chains are horribly fractured, and a lot of things, everything from electronics to cell phones, all the way to 70 or 80% of stuff in Walmart, they're imported in. And a lot of them are still imported from China. Hence why Scott Bessent, at the end of the day, had to cancel the 100% tariff threat. Now, what happens when the US dollar actually goes down? It becomes weaker. The cost of all your imports actually goes up. And that is independent of the tariff rates actually being imposed. So imagine if you slap China with a 30% tariff, which I believe is now the current rate is probably much higher than that, and you slap on a 10% additional so-called US dollar weakness tax on it. So right now, everything Americans are buying is anywhere from 10, 20, all the way to 40% higher, especially if you get stuff from China. And here's the amazing thing. Even today, China still exports around $1 billion worth of goods all the way to the United States. And this really begs the question, if Chinese goods has a 30 to 40% tariff stacked on them, what does this say about US goods when Americans are still buying these heavily tariff Chinese goods? Basically, it means that the cost of manufacturing in the United States is just too high. And that is something that really exposes the state of the US economy. Now, secondly, if the tariffs continue long enough, we'll begin to see more countries actually de-dollarize. Now, there are three main reasons why countries would want to get out the dollar, right? Two of them we already know throughout the last 5, 10, 15 years. The first one is dollar debasement. Now, this is something that everyone knows by now. Washington, they run up huge fiscal deficits. They keep playing with the interest rate. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, and it really pisses off a lot of countries. A lot of countries over the last 5 years, they've gotten into multiple currency crises. We look at the situation in Argentina where they need a lot of dollars to just fund themselves. So this is one reason why countries are getting out. Now, the second reason is something that we all know as well, which also goes back to the weaponization of the dollar, when the Americans during the Biden administration supported the Europeans by confiscating Russia's $300 billion. That really sent red flags up into the sky, right? If the US can confiscate all your assets, what's the point of really holding US Treasury bonds, US debt? Now, the last reason why the dollar likely is going to go down further is because of trade flows. Now, just think about it. If the US decides to close off their markets partially, which is a byproduct of the tariffs, when you impose a 10 to 20% tariff on the world, you're basically shutting off sections of the US consumers to imported goods. That means that the flow of dollars out to the global economy is going to come down because, well, the US, they are the originator of all the dollars, right? They print the money, the government racks up all these deficits. So the flow of dollars comes from the United States all the way to the rest of the world. So if countries around the world, for example, Indonesia, they just recently issued their own Chinese yuan RMB bond. Why are they doing this? Why not issue bonds in the US dollar like most emerging markets do? Because they are worried that if they beholden themselves too much to dollar debt, there is a chance that their trade with the United States drops further. And when it comes to getting back all these dollars to pay back the debts, they won't be able to find it. And they'll be stuck in another currency crisis. So the problem with this tariff war is that it actually incentivizes countries to de-dollarize even further, not only when it comes to holding assets such as treasury bonds for their own reserves, but also how they think about structuring their own debt. I would rather diversify out and issue more bonds in, for example, the Chinese RMB, because at the end of the day, half of the world's stuff, maybe 3/4 is all manufactured in China anyway. So I might as well just build relations with them and borrow in the Chinese RMB. And what does this do? It actually hammers demand for the dollar even lower. And as the Federal Reserve, they're about to cut rates. So the supply of dollars in the United States starts to go up, but demand outside starts to drop. What does this do? It hammers the price of the dollar even lower. So this is just one big cascading flywheel of dollars losing strength over time. And the longer this tariff war goes on, it's not going to look very well for the reserve currency.
Yeah. Great point, Sean. Professor Wolff there has talking about cascading effects. The Western mainstream media has been making much about the current state of the Trump administration's professed trade war. There's just been headline after headline after headline of China winning the trade war over and over, whether it's The Economist, whether it is, and I'll just pull that up here, whether it's The Economist or whether it is the Center for American Progress, which people may know is a very neocon aligned think tank. None of these are friendly to China. And they've gone even further, Professor Wolff, to talk about overall, because for a while now, there's been rumblings about a war with China. But a key point here, in the Atlantic, the U.S. is on track to lose a war with China. Modern warfare is decided by production capacity and technological mastery, not individual valor, as a shot against Trump. I wanted to ask you, Professor Wolff, how have you seen, what does this reflect? How have you seen the broader impact? There's major impacts, not only on the dollar, but on the U.S. empire itself. How do these headlines express that, and what are the details that may be missing?
Well, I think what you're noticing in all those headlines, as you have hinted in your introduction correctly, I think, is the gathering strength of those who were never happy with the tariff regime or with Trump or any of it, that they want what we had before. Lots of soft power, occasional military power for sure, military dominance. They want to go back just like Trump does, but they don't think doing it the way Mr. Trump is going to work. But he clearly destroyed them by being president twice, by making the religious intonation of MAGA and America First more persuasive to voters than they were able to make their version of what is not all that different in the way of goals. The problem for both of them, is that the American empire is simply declining, as we have discussed on this program. And as we know from history, every other empire always has. Every empire is born, over time it evolves, and then it passes away. You know, this should be elemental. The question is not whether the American empire will decline. It's really only a question of when. And the minute you know enough to ask that question, you're surrounded by evidence that the when is now. We can't do it. The war in Vietnam was lost by the United States. The war in Afghanistan was lost by the United States. In effect, the war in Ukraine has been lost by the United States. Yes, I know others were involved, but let's be real here. That's the reality. You can't dominate economically the way you once could. The dollar doesn't have the role it does. We see it everywhere unless we need not to see it. And what those articles show is that the opposition to Mr. Trump from the Democratic Party and from the business community, let me remind people, over the last 30 years, an enormous number of American, European, and Japanese corporations poured hundreds of billions of dollars into China. They don't want to give up on those investments. They do not want to write them off. It is still the case that wages are lower in China than in many other parts of the world. It is still the case that the Chinese economy as a market is the biggest and one of the fastest growing in the world. No business with half a brain wants to disengage from those factors about China. By contrast, the United States is a shrinking market, and it is a place in which wages are, again, too high. And that's the reality. And that's why the center of capitalism, the center of dynamic economic growth, has moved out of the United States. And it shouldn't surprise anyone. If you know American economic history, we began our capitalist dynamism in New England. Then it moved to the mid-Atlantic states. Then it moved to the Midwest. You know what we call the Midwest in the United States now? The Rust Belt, because it moved again. it was only a matter of time before the movement, driven by profit, took capitalists out of the United States, to Canada, to Mexico, to China, to India, to Brazil, and so on. That means the empire, the core of it, was gone. And once you moved the manufacturing, and let me remind you again, why did manufacturing leave the United States? Well, the basic answer is manufacturing workers who in the United States over the 19th and 20th century were overwhelmingly, here we go, white, male, Christian, unionized workers. They got the highest wages. If the profit motive is driving capitalists, which it is, then the workers they want to replace most urgently are the ones they pay the highest wages to. So they did it either by automation, the computer, robots, AI, or by relocating the jobs to where the wages were much slower. And that produced a very angry, bitter, white, Christian, male, unionized working class who shifted their votes to Mr. Trump and made him president because they were angry. This is not a long-term strategy, and it is now falling apart. And those neocons have figured out how to say that. And the way you say that is, oh my God, we're losing relative to our Chinese adversary. This is now supposed to get people to move. They dare not say what I just said. They couldn't give that analysis because look where it puts the onus on everything and where it puts the blame. I think it's deserved. This is their arcane language to get at the same result.
Yeah, Sean, jump in. How the U.S. has responded to all of this is more sanctions on Russia, trying to sanction off Chinese and Russian, Indian trade from Russia, especially in oil. And of course, tariffs after tariffs back and forth, as you've been covering, escalating them, pulling them back, not just with China, but really the entire world. Your reactions, your assessment of how this has really impacted the economic landscape more broadly.
I think we are beginning to see a sheer sense of desperation by the Trump administration when it comes to containing China, when it comes to containing Russia as well. Now, let's talk a bit about Trump's sanctions on Russian oil and his desire to get the world to entirely drop imports of Russian energy. Now, at the end of the day, this is not really going to work. It didn't work during the Biden administration from 2022 to 2024. It's definitely not going to work in 2025. You know, the entire game of whack-a-mole, using shell companies, using shadow fleets to transport Russian oil from Russia all the way to other parts of the world, it has been tried, it has been tested, and it's going to be replicated once again. Now, when Trump decided to hammer the world, saying that you cannot trade with two of the biggest Russian exporters, refiners out there, Rosneft and Lukoil, that basically is another warning to the world that the US is willing to weaponize every part of the global supply chain to enforce their own geopolitical outcomes. Now, what Trump really wants to do is to close the theater of war with the Russians so that he can fully concentrate on the economic confrontation with China. I think it's quite telling that if we go back to the discussions between the Russians and the Americans back in March, they were talking a lot about developing rare earths that were located under Ukraine/Russia, right? Recent statements from Trump said that he was very happy if Putin would just pack up and go home and all the territory towards the front, the borders of the conflict will be so-called taken up by Russia. Now, whether you agree with that or not is beyond it doesn't really matter. What really matters is the rare earths that's underneath the ground. So what Trump is trying to do is really a desperate confrontation to shore up US supply chains albeit he's doing it in a very wrong way to compete against China. I think if we step back and look at the greater scheme of things, the next battleground, which I've said many times, is going to be AI, semiconductors, and chips. And the United States right now, they're making an incredible bet to become number one, to always stay ahead of China, 1 or 2 steps ahead. And they're doing it in a very, very risky way. Now, there's a lot of reports out there in the financial press, even in other places like Reuters, Bloomberg, Politico, everywhere, talking about the AI bubble getting bigger and bigger, which is absolutely true. Now, what Trump is trying to do is to shore up every single lever that he has in the entire spectrum of the US economy in order to channel as much money as possible into artificial intelligence to create the most advanced AI out there to leapfrog China, if that's even possible. And because of that, he's running up record amounts of deficits. He's going around the world to Japan, to Korea, to other allies to do a global shakedown of money. He wants to squeeze at least 900 billion to $1 trillion from all these US allies, and he kind of exposed the grand plan of, I want to bring in $17 trillion into the United States. Now, maybe that figure comes from hype, but it really shows the amount of money that Trump is willing to place on the poker table to go against China. This is a very big, risky move because I guess the United States realizes that they don't really have a trump card that China has, which is an extremely big manufacturing base. Now, what China is doing with their own AI, with their own AI tech, is creating good enough models to actually influence and create better productivity in their industries. So their AI models is being tagged onto their industries. Their exports gets cheaper, gets more productive, and the money they get gets recycled back into Chinese AI. And that's a very different model, which is a bit more self-sustaining than what the US is trying to do to supercharge the entire AI tech using debt and deficits and money from their allies. So if we look at this entire tariff war, especially when it comes to taking money from Americans, consumers, back to the government, everything feeds back into this big economic confrontation with China. And I believe that it's going to get nastier, it's going to get worse, and the debt and deficits is going to run out of control. And I think the approach that Trump is really taking is a very dangerous one. It could lead to a very big financial crash if the AI gamble doesn't work out.
Yeah, and Professor Wolff, this attempt to, as the U.S. empire declines, to contain China, it's not really working. We see just in all areas, China has just announced that it's going to ramp up its investment in these critical chips. And as it does this, it's also making real headway, according to Bloomberg, and being the world leader in global science, showing that its scientists now are making up 45% of leadership roles in U.S.-China joint studies. So these are studies done between the United States and China, and it's climbing up from 30% just 15 years ago. But this is just across the board in all levels of technology, infrastructure development. You see it on social media. People are talking about China's rise and comparing it to the U.S.'s decline. This is really in the atmosphere, and it appears to be impacting Trump's policy, economic policy, and his overall policy of his administration. How have you seen this? What's your take on what's going on?
Accused of beating the dead horse. I gotta tell you, this is a decline of an empire. If you look at the 19th and 20th century, you would have seen that Britain was or Germany too, in a way, were the centers of scholarship and science until the United States got its economy going, its industry going, and then replicated and then went beyond what the British and the Germans could do, and ended up being the center of scientific innovation. I don't know if you caught, but there were recent studies that show that American universities, led by Harvard and other elite institutions, are cutting back on science, are cutting back on PhD programs, that Americans are more and more questioning going to college because you don't make any more money if you do than if you don't, and you're stuck with all that debt because the government won't support higher education the way it takes care of lower education. I mean, the comparison with China is stark. They're opening colleges and universities. We're closing them. They're expanding their programs. We're shrinking them. I mean, it's as obvious as you could imagine. And a little footnote, if I may. It is not a new insight, despite that headline you showed us, that a country's technological development will determine its military achievements. That is a very old idea. It is, of course, the case how many weapons you can produce, how many increases in weapon production in the event of a war can you accomplish. We're seeing it, by the way, in the war in Ukraine. The West is clearly now short of materials. After all the noise is done, one of the reasons shipment of weapons, both from the United States and from the Western European allies of Ukraine, have dropped to next to nothing. And the Ukraine army, which was outnumbered anyway before, is now completely at a loss and losing territory every day because the Russians have a technological foundation for producing more weapons, for replacing those that they lose, that gives them an edge militarily. Bingo, there you see it again. And the Chinese have the option, now that they are a larger economic totality than the United States. And again, the basic statistic, if you add up the GDPs of the United States and of the 6 other members of the G7, you come up with about 28% or so of global GDP. If you do the same for China and the BRICS, you come up with about 35, 36% of global GDP. This settles the conversation. And that gap, by the way, they were equal in the year 2020. So between 2020 and the end of 2025, it's a widening gap, 28% to 35%. Just think about what that is telling you about the industrial foundation, and you'll see that time, Mr. Xi Jinping knows, is on his side.
Yeah, Sean, definitely take it from there, because I know that you've been covering this a lot. These are massive global economic changes that impact the geopolitical foundations we talk about here on this channel, but also really reveal a larger development that is really changing everything about how the world operates and works. So yeah, take it from there.
Yeah, I'm sure that Professor Wolff has covered a lot about the academic achievements of China, how a lot of talent is being moved all the way to China, but it kind of goes beyond that. Now, I want to talk a bit about the reserve situations of how the US threat when it comes to Russian oil again is actually freaking out the Chinese. Now, part of the threat on Russian oil is that we are able to seize your assets. We are able to kick you out of the SWIFT system. We are able to block you from using the dollar payment rails if you try to buy oil from Russia or the 2 Russian companies itself. Now, this is a very big shock that started back in 2022. We never thought it would actually happen until the assets were seized. And now China themselves are beginning to sweat a little. Now, we've heard a lot about the dollarization, about China selling off their treasury bonds, China selling off a lot of their US assets. But if we look at how much they still own, it is still a tremendous amount. Now, I've covered this before, but if we lump in Hong Kong with mainland China, they still own $1 trillion worth of US Treasury bonds. And that is an extreme amount of exposure, right? Now, Ray Dalio recently said that if a country like the US goes ahead and confiscates Chinese assets, the long-term damage will be horrific to US reputation, especially when it comes to holding dollar assets. But in the short term, it is still a net negative to China. This is money that can help suppress US bond yields if it's just sitting in treasuries alone. Or you can take the money and can roll it into other industries, right? You can go around the world buying up stakes in rare earth mines. You can go give even more money, for example, to Argentina to develop the lithium under the ground, or you can pump it into AI. Now, definitely China doesn't want that to happen. So I think in the future, we can get to see two things which are quite baked into the cake. Now, firstly, I guess we can expect members of the BRICS, including China, to lose their faith in treasury bonds. They're going to get out of debt. And as time goes by, we can see a lot of the debt burden will be transferred all the way to the Western countries. It's basically going to be a bifurcation of assets in the world. The G7 and their allies will be helping support the United States dollar and the entire bond market, which means eventually, when a default happens, the back holders will be the G7, will be the West. However, China themselves, they'll be moving into other assets around the world. It could be gold, it could be their own RMB currency bonds. But the fact is that Trump has actually engineered the demise of the dollar itself long-term going forward. And this doesn't bode well for the entire US economy that needs consistent funding from the rest of the world to fund their incredibly crazy deficits. Because if you sit back and you think about it, even Elon Musk didn't manage to get the $2 trillion Doge savings, did he? What else can you cut? Can you cut Social Security? No, you can't. There'll be revolts in the country, right? People who pay into the system, they want to get paid out when they grow old. Can you cut defense spending? Are you kidding me? You can't cut defense spending, especially when the posture is so hostile against, for example, China, where you need to build a huge military to posture and to bluster. And especially when China has the industrial manufacturing capacity recently reported of 6 to 7 times that of the United States. So for every one missile the US can create, China can create 7 to 10. So definitely a lot of defense spending is going to be ramped up as well. And because of this entire bifurcation of the world, I think the United States, they're just going to push themselves closer and closer towards economic default. So I think Trump has really accelerated the end game for, the US empire, especially when it comes to the financial dollar as well.
Professor Wolff, as we get into the last few minutes here, any reactions to what Sean said and the overall situation that we're moving into and already in?
Well, I find something hopeful. I don't know whether Sean would agree, but I find something hopeful in what he says. And let me explain. There is lurking in the background, even if it cannot be spoken yet, an alternative way forward. And that is, instead of declaring that China's growth is the danger that has to be stopped or reversed or smashed or whatever word you want, there is the alternative. No, sit down and see whether there's a way of allowing China to grow by a shared relationship to the larger planet. In other words, you work out a deal so each of you can solve your problems without going to war against one another, which would solve nothing. And I'm going to use, I understand it's not an equivalent, but it's just a historical parallel that I have mentioned before that I think teaches a lesson. When the United States was still a colony of Great Britain, it decided that its economic growth was being stifled by the British, at that time, monarchy of George III. And so they went to war, the Revolutionary War, 1774, 5, 6, that period, end of the 18th century. And to the surprise of everybody, the British military that came over to fight the war to put down the revolutionaries was defeated, and the United States emerged as an independent country. A few years later, 1812, 1814, around then, a second war between Britain and the now independent United States was the mark of the British trying again by military means to undo the economic growth that was threatening them here in the United States. The British lost again, and the two defeats were sufficient to arrange a colonial deal. So obviously, it's a different time from now. But the colonial deal was, okay, the United States would stay out of the British way and concentrate its growth domestically and in the Western Hemisphere. And the British would have everything else: Asia, Africa, you name it, Europe, and so forth. Grandiose, hyperbolic for sure. But no more war, and the British economy did quite well in the rest of the 19th century. The United States economy did even better in the 19th century. So by the 20th century, the imbalance was such that the United States had effectively surpassed the British, but it never had to prove the point because the British, German, and other colonial empires destroyed one another, which is where that kind of economic nationalism typically ends. And a few years later, they did it all again. So the question is, are these histories a lesson for the American and the Chinese leaderships to let that alternative possibility perhaps have a place in the years ahead, not just this kind of confrontation, which will lead us to unimaginable situations?
Yeah, great question, Sean. In the last minute or two, if you have anything you want to close with, please.
Yes, I guess for the United States, I believe they need to really tone down and understand their limits to the world and how much you can push, how much you can exhaust your power before pissing off the whole world. You know, as Professor Wolff said, there are countless examples throughout history of how great leaders, great empires, great countries, at the end of the day, they engineer their own demise, right? We could see it, all the way from Alexander the Great, all the way to one example that I would use, which is basically Napoleon himself. Now, there was, towards the end of the war, Napoleon was so fixated with the British, right? I think there was a saying that the British, they were the masters of the sea, and Napoleon was undefeated within continental Europe. Right. And because of this fixation to bring down the British economy, he decided to create, I would guess, one of the most modern systems of embargo. It was called the Continental System. The entire of continental Europe couldn't trade with the British. But going forward, what do we see? You know, at the end of the day, one of Napoleon's biggest so-called allies who supported the system, the Russians, Imperial Russia, they decided not to follow the system. And because of that, Napoleon just couldn't take it. He embarked on the most disastrous campaign to invade Russia. At the end of the day, that engineered the entire demise of his entire empire. The French Empire got taken down just years after that. So I think this is a very big cautionary tale to the United States that yes, you guys are the biggest hegemon in the world, the biggest military out there, still hold the power of the United States dollar, but there are limits to how far you can push. You can push the limits, especially when there are other regional hegemons like China out there as well. So I think it's about maybe scaling back a bit.
Well, gentlemen, I have both of your YouTube channels. I have Democracy at Work in the video description. I have Sean Foo's channel as well in the video description. So everyone check that out after the show. Hit the like button before you do, because that will help keep this stream going after we are done here. And of course, you can find all the places to support this channel there too. Patreon, Substack, and much more. Thanks to everyone who watched. Thanks to all the moderators. Thanks to the one super chat here. Appreciate the support done. Without further ado, I'll be back in a couple of days on Halloween. I'll let you know what's on deck. Actually, a huge women's panel with Katie Halper, Manar Adley, and many more. So get ready for that. And until then, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.